In the dusty streets of a forgotten border town, where corruption flowed like water and justice seemed like a fairy tale, three men in expensive suits thought they owned the world. They had money, power, and most importantly, they had fear on their side. For months, they terrorized local businesses, extorted families, and turned a once peaceful community into their personal empire of greed. The police looked the other way. The mayor stayed silent. Even the bravest residents whispered their complaints behind closed doors, too afraid to speak up. These three men had built their kingdom on the simple belief that no one would dare challenge them. They were wrong. Sometimes justice doesn't come from where you expect it. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a man who has seen too much, lost too much, and decided that enough is enough. Sometimes that man wears the uniform of someone who has dedicated his entire life to protecting others, even when it costs him everything. This is the true story of how three criminals thought they had conquered a town, until the day a retired general walked into their world and reminded them that some people cannot be bought, cannot be intimidated, and will never back down from a fight that matters. What happened next would change everything, not just for these three men, but for an entire community that had forgotten what it meant to stand up for what's right. The sun barely touched the horizon when Marcus Rivera stepped out of his black SUV, his polished leather shoes hitting the cracked pavement of Main Street. Behind him, two other men emerged from the vehicle: Diego Santos, a man whose smile never reached his eyes, and Carlos Mendez, whose massive frame cast shadows that seemed to swallow the morning light. Together, they represented everything wrong with the small border town of San Esperanza. Marcus adjusted his expensive watch, a gold Rolex that caught the early sunlight like a warning signal. He had bought it with money stolen from the very people who now watched him from behind their curtains, too afraid to show their faces. For 8 months, these three men had turned San Esperanza into their personal playground, and today was just another day in their reign of terror. The first stop was always the same: Elena's Bakery. The small shop had been serving the community for over 20 years, filling the air with the warm scent of fresh bread and pastries that reminded everyone of better times. Elena Vargas, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and weathered hands, had built this business from nothing, working 16-hour days to support her family and employ 3 local women who desperately needed the work. The bell above the door chimed as Marcus pushed inside, followed by his 2 companions. The customers who had been enjoying their morning coffee and pastries suddenly found reasons to leave, abandoning half-eaten meals and warm conversations. Elena stood behind the counter, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the glass display case. "Good morning, Elena," Marcus said, his voice smooth as silk but carrying an undertone that made everyone's skin crawl. "Beautiful day, isn't it? Perfect weather for business." Elena forced a smile that didn't hide the fear in her eyes. "Yes, it's a lovely morning. What can I get for you today?" Diego laughed, a sound like broken glass hitting concrete. "You know why we're here, Elena. Same reason we come every Tuesday. Time for your contribution to our Community Development Fund." The Community Development Fund was their cruel joke, a name they had given to their extortion scheme that made it sound almost legitimate. Every business owner in San Esperanza knew the real deal. Pay them a weekly fee, or watch your shop burn down. Refuse to cooperate, and your family might find themselves in danger. It was simple, effective, and completely evil. Elena opened the cash register with shaking fingers, pulling out the stack of bills she had prepared the night before. It represented nearly a third of her weekly earnings, money that should have gone to buying supplies, paying her employees, or feeding her own family. Instead, it disappeared into Marcus's pocket like water down a drain. "You know, Elena," Carlos spoke for the first time, his voice deep and menacing. "My nephew mentioned your daughter is starting college next month. University is expensive these days. Would be terrible if something happened to interrupt her education." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a fire. Elena's daughter Maria was her pride and joy, a brilliant girl who had earned a scholarship to study engineering. The thought of these monsters going anywhere near her child made Elena's blood turn to ice. "She's a good girl," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "She works hard, stays out of trouble. Please don't bring her into this." Marcus smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Of course she's a good girl. That's why nothing will happen to her, as long as you continue being such a cooperative member of our business community. They left the bakery with Elena's money and her dignity, moving on to their next victim like wolves hunting in a pack. The pattern was always the same: intimidation disguised as friendly conversation, threats wrapped in concern, and money exchanging hands while fear settled over the shop like a dark cloud. At Rodriguez Auto Repair, they collected from Miguel Rodriguez, a man who had once been proud of his successful business but now looked like he had aged 10 years in the past 8 months. Miguel's son had tried to stand up to them once, refusing to let them park their stolen cars in his father's lot. That son now wore a cast on his left arm and walked with a permanent limp. The message had been received loud and clear throughout the community. Resistance was not only futile, it was dangerous. The barber shop, the grocery store, the small restaurant that served the best tacos in town. Every business owner knew the routine. They had learned to keep the money ready, to smile when these three devils walked through their doors, and to never, ever think about fighting back. But it wasn't just the business owners who suffered. The three men had expanded their operation to include ordinary families, especially those who showed any signs of prosperity. If you bought a new car, they wanted their share. If you received money from relatives working in America, they expected their cut. If your children did well in school and attracted attention, they saw it as an opportunity to demand payment for protection. The Hernandez family learned this lesson the hard way. Juan Hernandez worked as a foreman at the local construction company, earning an honest living that allowed him to provide for his wife Carmen and their 2 young children. When Juan received a bonus for completing a difficult project ahead of schedule, he made the mistake of celebrating by taking his family to dinner at the nicest restaurant in town. Marcus, Diego, and Carlos happened to be at the same restaurant that evening, conducting their own kind of business with the owner. They noticed the Hernandez family's celebration, saw Juan paying the bill without hesitation, and decided that this family had been flying under their radar for too long. 2 days later, they appeared at Juan's small but comfortable home, uninvited and unwelcome. Carmen was hanging laundry in the backyard while her children played nearby, when the 3 men walked through her front door like they owned the place. "Beautiful home you have here," Marcus said, running his finger along Carmen's carefully polished dining table. "Nice neighborhood, good schools for the kids. You've really built something special." Juan emerged from the kitchen, his face pale but determined. He had heard the stories, knew exactly who these men were and what they wanted. "This is my home. You have no right to be here." Diego picked up a framed photo from the mantelpiece. Juan and Carmen on their wedding day, both of them young and full of hope for the future. "Look at this, Carlos. Young love. So beautiful, so fragile. Would hate to see anything happen to disturb such happiness." The photo slipped from Diego's fingers, crashing to the floor in an explosion of glass and memories. Carmen's sharp intake of breath could be heard from the backyard, where she had stopped hanging clothes to listen to the conversation inside her home. "Here's how this works, Juan," Marcus explained, settling into Juan's favorite chair like he planned to stay forever. "We provide protection services for this neighborhood. For a reasonable monthly fee, we make sure nothing bad happens to your house, your car, or your family. It's a dangerous world out there, and a man with responsibilities like yours needs to think about security." Juan's hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. "We don't need protection. This is a safe neighborhood." Carlos laughed, a sound that made the walls seem to shake. "Safe? Things change, my friend. Accidents happen. Break-ins occur. Sometimes good people get hurt for no reason at all. But with our protection plan, you'll never have to worry about such problems." The implied threat was crystal clear. Pay us, or we'll be the ones making sure those accidents and break-ins happen. Juan looked toward the backyard where his children's laughter could still be heard, innocent and unaware of the evil that had entered their world. By the time the 3 men left, Juan had agreed to pay them $300 every month, nearly a quarter of his salary. It was money his family desperately needed for food, clothing, and his children's education. But what choice did he have? The safety of his family was worth any sacrifice. This scene played out across San Esperanza like a plague spreading through the community. Families who had worked their entire lives to build something better found themselves trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape. The police, led by Chief Rodriguez, claimed their hands were tied. They said they needed evidence, witnesses, concrete proof of wrongdoing. But everyone knew the truth. They were either paid off or too scared to act. The mayor, a man named Fernando Gutierrez, who had once promised to bring prosperity and justice to San Esperanza, had become a ghost in his own town hall. When concerned citizens tried to meet with him, they were told he was too busy with important regional matters. When reporters from the state capital tried to investigate rumors of corruption, they found a community too frightened to speak, and officials too careful to say anything meaningful. Meanwhile, Marcus, Diego, and Carlos grew bolder and more arrogant with each passing day. They began showing up at community events, acting like respected members of society instead of the parasites they truly were. At the annual Harvest Festival, they set up their own booth, selling raffle tickets for prizes they claimed were donated by local businesses. In reality, they had simply taken the items they wanted from various shops, knowing the owners would never dare to object. Children began to recognize them, learning to cross the street when they saw the black SUV approaching. Parents told their kids to stay indoors after dark, to never walk alone, and to run straight home from school. The vibrant community that had once thrived on friendship and mutual support became a place where neighbors eyed each other suspiciously, wondering who might be working with the three men, or who might be the next target. The psychological impact was perhaps worse than the financial damage. People stopped trusting each other, stopped believing in the possibility of justice, stopped hoping for a better future. San Esperanza was dying from the inside out, its spirit broken by fear and hopelessness. But in a small house on the outskirts of town, an old man sat in his study, reading newspaper reports about the deteriorating situation in San Esperanza. General Roberto Castellanos, retired from the army after 35 years of service, had been following the story of his hometown's decline with growing anger and determination. He had fought in wars, commanded troops, and dedicated his life to protecting innocent people from exactly the kind of evil that now controlled his birthplace. The general was 72 years old, with silver hair and deep lines carved by years of difficult decisions and moral courage. He had been living quietly in the state capital, enjoying his retirement and spending time with his grandchildren. But the reports from San Esperanza had stirred something deep within him that couldn't be ignored. His youngest sister, Rosa, still lived in San Esperanza with her husband and teenage daughter. She had called him the previous week, her voice breaking as she described the monthly payments they were forced to make, the constant fear that shadowed their daily lives, and the way her daughter no longer wanted to invite friends over because she was embarrassed by their family's obvious terror. "Roberto," Rosa had whispered into the phone, "I know you're retired, I know you've earned your peace, but these men are destroying our town. They're killing everything good and decent about the place where we grew up. Someone needs to stop them." As General Castellanos sat in his study that night, looking at photographs from his childhood in San Esperanza, pictures of festivals and celebrations, of neighbors helping neighbors, of a community that believed in justice and goodness, he made a decision that would change everything. He began making phone calls to old friends, men and women who had served with him, who understood the meaning of duty and sacrifice. He researched Marcus Rivera, Diego Santos, and Carlos Mendez, learning about their criminal histories, their methods of operation, and their connections to larger criminal organizations. Most importantly, he started planning his return to San Esperanza. The three men who had terrorized an entire community were about to learn that some people cannot be bought, cannot be intimidated, and will never surrender to evil, no matter the cost. They had made the mistake of thinking that retired meant defeated, that age meant weakness, and that absence meant indifference. They were about to discover how wrong they could be. General Roberto Castellanos was coming home, and with him came the promise of justice that the people of San Esperanza had been praying for since their nightmare began. The war for the soul of their community was about to begin. And this time, the good guys had a leader who knew how to fight and win. The old pickup truck rolled into San Esperanza on a Wednesday morning, its faded blue paint and weathered exterior drawing no attention from the few people walking the streets. The driver appeared to be just another elderly man, perhaps visiting relatives or conducting some mundane business in the small border town. No one recognized the tall figure behind the wheel, his silver hair hidden beneath a worn baseball cap. his piercing eyes scanning the streets he remembered from his childhood. General Roberto Castellanos had been away from San Esperanza for over 40 years, but the town's layout was etched into his memory like a map drawn in permanent ink. He drove slowly past Elena's bakery, noting the help wanted sign that had been hanging in the window for months, a clear indication that business was struggling. He saw the boarded-up windows of what used to be the town's thriving hardware store, another casualty of the economic terrorism that had gripped the community. The general had spent 3 weeks preparing for this moment, gathering intelligence like he was planning a military campaign. Through careful phone calls to old contacts and discreet conversations with former colleagues who had connections in law enforcement, he had learned everything he needed to know about Marcos Rivera, Diego Santos, and Carlos Mendez. Marcos was the brains of the operation, a former accountant who had been fired from his job at a regional bank for embezzling funds. He was smart, calculating, and utterly ruthless in his pursuit of money and power. His expensive suits and cultured manner masked the soul of a predator who saw other people's suffering as nothing more than a business opportunity. Diego Santos was the enforcer, a man with a violent past that included assault charges, armed robbery, and suspected involvement in several murders that could never be proven. He had learned his trade working for various criminal organizations along the border, developing a reputation for creative cruelty that made him valuable to employers who needed people to be very, very afraid. Carlos Mendez was the muscle, a former boxer who had been banned from professional competition for using illegal substances and assaulting a referee. His size and strength made him perfect for intimidation, and his lack of intelligence made him easy for Marcos to control. He followed orders without question and seemed to genuinely enjoy causing pain to innocent people. Together, they represented a classic criminal organization structure: the mastermind, the specialist, and the enforcer. They had chosen San Esperanza because it was small enough to control completely, but large enough to provide substantial income from their extortion schemes. The isolation of the border town meant that outside law enforcement rarely paid attention to what happened there, giving them the freedom to operate with virtual impunity. But General Castellanos had faced far more dangerous enemies than 3 small-town criminals. He had commanded troops in combat zones where life-and-death decisions were made in seconds. He had negotiated with warlords, politicians, and international criminals who made Marcos Rivera look like a petty thief. Most importantly, he had never lost a campaign when the cause was just and the mission was clear. His first stop was his sister Rosa's house, a small but well-maintained home on Maple Street, where he had spent countless summer afternoons as a child. Rosa answered the door with obvious nervousness, her eyes darting up and down the street before quickly pulling him inside. At 68, she still resembled the little girl who had followed him around the neighborhood, but the lines of worry and fear had aged her beyond her years. "Roberto, what are you doing here?" she whispered, as if the walls might have ears. "If they see you visiting me, they might think I called for help." They don't like it when people bring outsiders into town, especially family members who might cause trouble. The general embraced his sister, feeling the tension in her shoulders and the way she trembled slightly in his arms. This woman had raised 4 children, survived the death of her first husband in a construction accident, and worked 2 jobs to put her kids through school. She had faced every challenge life threw at her with courage and determination, but these 3 criminals had reduced her to a frightened shadow of herself. "Tell me everything," he said simply, settling into the living room where family photos covered every surface. Pictures of graduations, weddings, birthdays, and holidays. All the moments that made life worth living, now overshadowed by the constant threat of violence and extortion. Rosa's story poured out like water from a broken dam. She described the monthly payments that consumed nearly half of her husband's pension, the way her teenage granddaughter had stopped bringing friends home from school, and the constant anxiety that made it impossible to enjoy even simple pleasures like gardening or watching television. "They know everything about everyone," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "They know when people get paid, when families receive money from relatives in America, when someone has a good month at their business. It's like they have spies everywhere. Or maybe people are so scared they just tell them whatever they want to know." Her husband Manuel joined the conversation, a man who had once been proud of his service in the local fire department but now seemed diminished by months of helpless rage. "I've thought about fighting back, Roberto. God knows I've thought about it. But what can one old man do against three younger, stronger criminals who have no conscience and no limits?" The general listened carefully, asking specific questions about the three men's routines, their methods of collecting payments, their relationships with local officials, and their security arrangements. He was particularly interested in their schedule, when they made their rounds, where they met to divide their profits, and how they communicated with each other. Over the next several days, General Castellanos conducted his own surveillance operation, observing the three criminals with the patience and precision of a professional soldier. He rented a small room above the town's only restaurant, giving him a perfect view of Main Street and most of the commercial district. From this vantage point, he could watch their daily routine unfold like a carefully choreographed dance of intimidation and theft. Every Tuesday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, they began their collection rounds at Elena's bakery. They moved in a predictable pattern. The bakery, then the auto repair shop, followed by the barber shop, the grocery store, and finally the small restaurant below his temporary hideout. The entire process took approximately 3 hours, during which they collected thousands of dollars from business owners who had no choice but to pay. But the general was most interested in what happened after the collections were finished. The three men always met at an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, where they counted their money and planned their next moves. The warehouse had been empty for years, ever since the small manufacturing company that owned it had moved operations to a larger city. It was isolated, defensible, and perfect for criminal activities. During his surveillance, the general also began reaching out to people in the community, carefully testing their willingness to resist the three criminals. He started with people he had known in his youth, childhood friends, former classmates, and family members who remembered him from before his military career took him away from San Esperanza. Father Martinez, the elderly priest at the local Catholic church, was among the first to express interest in fighting back. The church had been forced to give up a significant portion of its weekly collection to the three criminals, money that had previously been used to help the poorest families in the community and maintain the historic building that served as the spiritual heart of San Esperanza. "These men are evil incarnate," Father Martinez told the general during a private meeting in the church's small office. "They have turned our community into a place of fear and despair. I've prayed for guidance, and I believe God has sent you to us for a purpose." Patricia Morales, the town's only physician, was another early ally. The three criminals had demanded free medical care for themselves and their associates, threatening to shut down her practice if she refused. Worse, they had begun pressuring her to provide them with prescription drugs that they could sell for additional profit, putting her medical license and professional integrity at risk. "I took an oath to do no harm," she told the general, "but by helping these criminals, I'm harming every person in this community who lives in fear of them. If you have a plan to stop them, you can count on my support." Slowly, carefully, General Castellanos began building a network of resistance within San Esperanza. He reached out to former soldiers who had settled in the area after their military service, retired police officers who were disgusted by the current department's inaction, and business owners who had reached the breaking point of their endurance. The key recruitment was Miguel Torres, a former sergeant who had served under the general's command 15 years earlier during a peacekeeping mission in Central America. Miguel now owned a small security company that provided guards for construction sites and special events in the region. More importantly, he had maintained contacts with active-duty military personnel and law enforcement officers who could potentially provide support when the time came for action. "General, I've been waiting for someone to organize resistance against these parasites," Miguel told him during a late-night meeting at the abandoned gas station where they wouldn't be observed. "I have 6 men who work for me, all former military, all disgusted by what's happening here. We're tired of watching good people suffer while criminals live like kings." The general's plan began to take shape as he gathered more intelligence and recruited more allies. He had no intention of matching the criminals' violence with equal brutality. That would make him no better than they were. Instead, he would use superior planning, coordination, and psychological warfare to defeat them, while providing the evidence necessary to ensure their legal prosecution. The first phase involved documentation. Using small hidden cameras provided by Miguel's security company, they began recording the three criminals' extortion activities. Every collection, every threat, every act of intimidation was captured on video, with clear audio and timestamps. Within 2 weeks, they had accumulated enough evidence to convict Marcus, Diego, and Carlos of dozens of felonies. But evidence alone wouldn't solve the problem if the local authorities were too corrupt or frightened to act on it. The general needed to ensure that when the criminals were finally arrested, they would face justice from officials who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Through his military contacts, he arranged meetings with federal law enforcement officials who had jurisdiction over organized criminal activities that crossed state lines. The three criminals' operation technically fell under federal authority because they were extorting money from businesses that conducted interstate commerce, and because their activities affected the flow of legitimate trade along the border. Agent Sarah Williams, a federal prosecutor who specialized in organized crime cases, reviewed the evidence that General Castellanos had collected and immediately recognized its value. "This is exactly the kind of comprehensive documentation we need to build an airtight case," she told him during a secure phone conversation. "But we'll need to coordinate the arrests carefully to ensure these men don't have time to destroy evidence or flee the area." The second phase of the plan involved psychological operations designed to make the three criminals nervous and prone to mistakes. The general had learned during his military career that confident enemies were dangerous enemies, but paranoid enemies often defeated themselves through poor decision-making and internal conflicts. Strange things began happening to Marcus, Diego, and Carlos that couldn't be easily explained. Their car tires would go flat overnight, forcing them to change them in public where people could see them looking vulnerable and inconvenienced. Anonymous tips reached them suggesting that rivals from other criminal organizations were planning to move into their territory. Packages containing newspaper clippings about successful prosecutions of extortion rings appeared on their doorsteps with no indication of who had delivered them. Most effective of all, they began receiving phone calls at odd hours from people who claimed to be federal investigators, asking questions about their business activities in San Esperanza. The calls were actually made by Miguel's men using voice-changing technology, but they sounded official enough to create serious anxiety among the three criminals. Marcus began showing signs of stress, snapping at his partners over minor issues and obsessing over security measures that had never concerned him before. Diego became even more violent and unpredictable, lashing out at victims with unnecessary brutality that drew more attention to their activities. Carlos, always the least intelligent member of the group, started drinking heavily and talking too much in public places where his words could be overheard and reported. The third phase involved building community support for active resistance. General Castellanos organized secret meetings with business owners, family leaders, and other influential members of the community, convincing them that victory was possible if they worked together. "These three men have power because you believe they have power," he told a gathering of 25 people in the basement of Father Martinez's church. "They control you through fear, but fear is only effective when you face it alone. Together, we outnumber them 100 to 1. Together, we have resources they can't match. Together, we can take back our community." Elena from the bakery was among the first to openly express her willingness to fight back. "I'm tired of being afraid in my own business, in my own town," she declared. "If the general has a plan to stop them, I'll do whatever it takes to help." Juan Hernandez, the construction foreman who had been forced to pay monthly protection money, stood up and made his own commitment. "My children ask me why bad men can take our money and there's nothing we can do about it. I want to tell them that good people always find a way to defeat evil, but first we have to make that true." One by one, the people of San Esperanza began to rediscover their courage and their faith in the possibility of justice. The general had given them something they had lost during 8 months of terrorist rule: hope for a better future and a concrete plan for achieving it. The final phase would require perfect timing, flawless execution, and a little bit of luck. But General Roberto Castellanos had spent his entire adult life preparing for moments like this, situations where leadership and moral courage could make the difference between victory and defeat, between justice and injustice, between hope and despair. Marcus Rivera, Diego Santos, and Carlos Mendez had no idea what was coming for them. But their reign of terror over San Esperanza was about to come to an end. The general's war for his hometown had entered its decisive phase, and this time, the good guys were ready to win.